Learn more about modern paganism by joining our upcoming seminar with scholar Thorne Mooney. Go to religiondepartment.com/contemporary paganism. The year is 1789. The French Revolution is erupting in Paris. George Washington has just become the first president of the US. And the Enlightenment is in full swing, reshaping Europe's intellectual and religious landscape. And yet, on the eastern edge of the continent, something else is happening. In Estonia, a Lutheran pastor named August Wilhelm Hupel recorded a local religious practice he recently witnessed in his parish. Among other things, the peasants had the habit of fencing in some old tree, an empty space, or a small pile of stones. And then from time to time, they would bring offerings to the earth goddess. Milk, butter, wool, money, and they would also kill a black rooster in her honor around April 23rd. For this reason, these places had a special sacrificial stone. Wait, hold on. An earth goddess in Europe in 1789? Apparently, yes. While revolution was sweeping through Europe and the Americas, some Estonian villagers were still honoring pre-Christian gods with live animal sacrifice. And they were not alone. Today we're rethinking a common assumption, that Europe was fully Christianized by the Middle Ages, and that paganism disappeared long ago, leaving behind only faint echoes in folklore and folk practice. But as the historian Francis Young argues in his book Silence of the Gods, the reality is much more complex. Christianization did not sweep across Europe like an unstoppable wave. In some regions, Christianization just stalled. Even where churches were being built and baptisms being performed, many communities continued practicing older forms of religion well into the modern period. So who are we talking about here? Broadly speaking, we're talking about the indigenous peoples of Europe's northern and eastern frontiers, groups who lived outside the political and cultural centers of medieval Christendom, from the Arctic Circle down through the Baltic coast and into the vast western interior of Russia. This included peoples such as the Sámi, the indigenous people of northern Fennoscandia, today's Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia's Kola Peninsula. The Sámi retained elements of their pre-Christian religion well into the 17th and 18th centuries. Their religious specialists used drums and trance states to mediate between humans and the spirit world, sometimes called shamanism. Sámi cosmology was deeply tied to the land, and many continued their traditional sacrificial rites even after their nominal Christianization. Next are the Baltic peoples, especially the Lithuanians, Latvians, and the Old Prussians. Lithuania's elite technically converted to Christianity in 1387, but pre-Christian religion continued for generations. Even into the early modern period, church and court records describe locals refusing Christian burial and continuing to honor older gods. In 1789, Hupel mentions Latvian farmers honoring a household god called Mājas kungs, Lord of the House. On St. Michael's Day on September 29th, they'd make a pile of rocks and then sacrifice a rooster there and pour out a libation of beer for the spirit's protection. Then we have the Finnic and Ugric peoples of northeastern Europe and the Volga-Ural region. This includes the Estonians, the Mari, the Mordvins, and the Komi. These non-Slavic peoples lived on the peripheries of the expanding Russian Orthodox and Lutheran empires, and were often targets of missionary campaigns. But Christianization here was slow and uneven. The Mari, for instance, openly continued animal sacrifices into the 1800s. From that point onward, revivalist movements produced a distinct form of Mari traditional religion that has continued to this day. In fact, in 1992, the president of the Mari El Republic in Russia was inaugurated both by an Orthodox priest and an animist priest. The Estonians as well, who we'll examine as the main case study, maintained a rich landscape of sacred natural sites woven into everyday religious life. For example, check out this catechism from northern Estonia dating to 1694. It was used to instruct students on violations of the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. The Catechism warns not to give honor which is meant only for God, to figures like the Earth Mother, beings called under-earths, as well as to hills, stones, springs, steam of sauna, groves or trees and forests considered to be holy, bringing them sacrifices or in some other ways serving idols. The tone is unmistakable. This catechism is warning against practices that are still familiar enough to need explicit instruction against them. In 1694 Estonia, the author clearly expects his readers to recognize these behaviors from everyday life. All of these groups are often labeled the last pagans of Europe, a phrase that sounds dramatic, but needless to say raises an eyebrow among the many contemporary pagans of Europe who are alive and well today. Dr. Young, like many scholars, tries to avoid using the word pagan to describe these people groups. Now, on one hand, it's a convenient public-facing term that most people recognize, which is why he uses it in the title of his book and why I used it in the title of this YouTube video. On the other hand, paganism functions as an overly vague umbrella category that lumps together radically different traditions. You worship Zeus? Pagan. You offer milk to a sacred rock in 17th century Estonia? also pagan. But these two examples have basically nothing in common except that they're not Christian. Many of these peoples practice what scholars today call animism, which itself has a very complicated history. European anthropologists like E.B. Tylor used it dismissively to describe so-called primitive beliefs in spirits or magical thinking. But more recent scholarship has redefined animism as a relational worldview, one that understands humans as living in ongoing relationships with the material and natural worlds. In this view of animism, personhood is not limited to humans but can extend to landscapes, animals, objects, natural phenomena, and natural features like a mountain or river. As the scholar of religion Graham Harvey puts it, animism is a worldview in which the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human. Using this definition, scholars often describe the religions of the Sámi, the Estonians, the Mari, and others as animist, even though their practices varied widely across time and space. Though Dr. Young points out in his book that nothing about this definition of animism necessarily requires polytheism, sacrifice, temples, cult images, and so forth. Indeed, it's not altogether clear from this definition that animism need to be considered religion at all. That's part of the reason why Dr. Young prefers terms like unchristianized peoples. It focuses on what these people groups actually shared, that Christianity had not yet been deeply integrated into everyday life, without pretending that these groups all formed a single religious tradition. This phrasing also helps keep the historical analysis separate from contemporary paganism. These identities are shaped by very different social and historical conditions, living in what are now largely Christianized societies. Now, I've been using this term Christianization a lot, and this refers to the process by which a society adopts Christianity politically, culturally, and socially. That can involve rulers converting to Christianity, churches being built, kids being baptized with Christian names, calendars being reorganized around Christian holidays, marriages and burials brought under church control, and clergy becoming the recognized authorities of major life events. Needless to say, this process involves a lot. Christianization is often presented as a series of decisive conversion moments. A ruler converts, an edict is issued, and boom, the kingdom becomes Christian. Think of Constantine in the 4th century, for example. But for this topic, the classic example is the Christianization of Lithuania in 1387. At the time, the Grand Duke of Lithuania accepted baptism, married the Polish queen, and brought Lithuania into a political alliance with Poland. Christianity became the official religion of the Lithuanian state. And because Lithuania was the last officially pagan kingdom in Europe, this moment is often treated as the definitive end of European paganism. But this is where the model begins to break down. We really should not consider Christianization as ever a single event. Like any complex cultural phenomenon, Christianization was a long, uneven, and contested process. A negotiation between missionaries and local cultures, between institutional authorities and lived religious practices on the ground. Official adoption often blanketed over deep continuities in ritual life that persisted for generations. I study the late Roman Empire, for example, and you see the same pattern much earlier in late antique Egypt. The spread of Christianity there didn't necessarily erase older religious habits. Now, monks and bishops condemned temples and traditional gods, but practices tied to healing, protection, sacred places, and local ambiguous spirits continued for centuries, though now sometimes framed in Christian language. So on paper, Roman Egypt was Christian, and on the ground, change was gradual. Dr. Young proposes a set of markers to identify an unchristianized society, including large numbers of unbaptized adults in the population, ongoing sacrifices or libations to pre-Christian deities, the veneration of specific gods through their images, the veneration of sacred natural sites like sacred groves in ways that are not tied to Christian piety, and in some cases, open rejection of church teaching or authority. In other words, these were societies where Christian symbols, beliefs, and practices had not yet meaningfully shaped religious life, where Christianity remained peripheral or cosmetic. Now, the tricky thing is, we know very, very little about most of these religions before they encountered Christianity. Aside from scattered archaeological remains, nearly all of our evidence was written down after Christian contact, and usually written down by outsiders who were confused, hostile, or trying to suppress what they were observing, like August Wilhelm Hupel, who I quoted at the start. That means when historians talk about pre-Christian pagan survivals, they're rarely describing untouched remnants of ancient religion. More often, they're describing beliefs and practices already in the midst of being Christianized, reshaped by centuries of contact, pressure, and reinterpretation. A vivid example is the Latvian goddess Dekla, whom the 17th century Latvian Lutheran pastor Paul Einhorn describes as a protector of children. She, when a child is born, rocks them, for it is her duty to rock and protect little children. though there's a strong possibility that Dekla is not a pre-Christian deity, but rather a paganized transformation of the famous Christian Saint Thecla. As Dr. Young writes, apparently so-called pre-Christian beliefs and rites were sometimes a response to Christianity, rather than something predating its introduction. To make sense of this, Young uses the concept of creolization. The term originally comes from linguistics, where it refers to a new language that develops from the interaction of two or more parent languages. Haitian Creole, for example, is not French with African influences, but it's also not an African language with French influences. It's a distinct language that evolved from prolonged contact between French and various West and Central African languages, eventually stabilizing into a fully distinct language. Religions can do this too. Enslaved Africans in European colonies in the Caribbean and Latin America brought their traditional West and Central African religions into direct contact with their enslavers' Catholicism. Over generations, this produced religions like Haitian Vodou and Santeria. In Haitian Vodou, practitioners interact with spirits known as Loa, who have distinct personalities, domains, and ritual expectations. These Loa are often identified with specific African deities, as well as Catholic saints. And many practitioners may describe themselves as Catholic and attend church or use Christian symbols. But Vodou functions as its own religion, with its own cosmology, ritual specialists, and modes of engagement with the divine. Dr. Young argues that something similar happened in North and Northeastern Europe, where Christianization either stalled or remained shallow. Local communities continued their traditional practices, but they evolved and adapted in response to Christian influence, creating Creole religions that were neither fully Christian nor fully pre-Christian. Another example was recorded by a Lutheran pastor in Latvia dating to 1717, when an innkeeper put out an offering to a non-Christian deity on Christmas Eve. Late in the evening, he lit 4 fires at some distance from the 4 corners of the barn, and on the table in the barn he put a bunch of hay, a loaf of bread, and a lamp, singing and praying with his people. When asked, he explained that it happens to honor the Blueque deity. The name Blueque appears to be connected to the word for a log, maybe the large log traditionally burned on Christmas across Europe. Now, while the Yule log is often described today as a pagan survival, the earliest evidence we have for this practice comes from Christian sources linking the practice explicitly to Christmas. So, like the goddess Dekla, we might be seeing an example of creolized religious practice, in this case a Christian folk practice, the Yule log, being reread through the lens of pre-Christian animism. See, rituals involving a sacred log are actually well documented in the Baltic region. In Latvia and Lithuania, Christmas celebrations to this day sometimes involve dragging a large log, called a blucas, through the village before finally burning it in a communal fire. Early modern observers occasionally describe the log being treated almost like a living being. Beer might be poured into a hole carved into it, food offerings such as bread or hay were placed nearby it before it was burned, and sometimes a human face was even carved into it. At the same time, the word Blucas seems to come from German, so some historians think that the custom itself spread from a German Christmas tradition invented by German Christians, rather than preserving a purely pre-Christian Baltic ritual. Dr. Young admits, while the Yule log may have pagan origins, it is perhaps better understood as the wooden equivalent of a goose or turkey, a special treat for the Christmas season. Hence why I call it a Christian folk practice and not necessarily a pre-Christian pagan practice. So to return to the Blueque example again, we can envision Latvian villagers first encountering this new ritual calendar of Christianity. Christmas is now marked as a powerful and sacred night. A massive log is burned. People gather, sing, and they pray. To someone whose religious world is already populated by spirits and personified ritual objects, it's not a huge leap in logic to interpret this log as a being with its own presence and agency. In that sense, an 18th century report of a Latvian deity called Blueque isn't necessarily evidence of an ancient god surviving unchanged beneath Christianity. It could be a sign of a new pagan practice responding and evolving in response to Christianity. This process is often described as syncretism. But we shouldn't think of syncretism or creolization in the sense of two big religious systems merging into a hybrid. It's more accurate to think of it as a process when people encounter a new religious belief or practice but rework it, relying on familiar ways of understanding illness, fertility, misfortune, or the divine. Saints take over the roles once filled by local gods or spirits. Sacred places remain sacred even as the stories change around them. It's basically religious bricolage, a word meaning putting something together using whatever materials happen to be available, which makes syncretism a form of religious innovation under pressure. Syncretism or creolization also helps explain that it might miss the point to try to classify communities like the Latvians or the Sámi in the 1700s as either pagan or Christian. Framing what we see here as either failed conversion or stubborn survival assumes that religion only changes through replacement. But pagan cultures themselves are dynamic and they're changing. What the evidence points to then is the emergence of new religious forms, shaped by Christian contact, pressure, and coercion, but reworked through older religious habits. Now, we could spend an entire video on any of the peoples we've mentioned so far, the Sámi, the Lithuanians, or the Mari. But for this episode, we're going to zoom in on the Estonians as our main case study, because by some measures, the Estonians were one of the last peoples to worship pre-Christian deities, perhaps into the early 20th century. The Estonians are a Finnic people, culturally and linguistically distinct from their Indo-European neighbors. Their language is closely related to Finnish, and their geographic position puts them at the crossroads of the Baltic and Fennoscandia. Now, Christianity did arrive in Estonia relatively early by Northern European standards. Beginning in the early 1200s, Estonia was forcibly incorporated into Latin Christendom through a series of German and Danish crusades, stretching roughly from 1206 to 1227. These campaigns are described in detail by the missionary priest Henry of Livonia, written down in his Chronicle of Livonia, one of our main narrative sources for the conquest of the Eastern Baltic. So from the perspective of church and empire, the story looks decisive. Pagan strongholds were defeated, churches were built, parish networks were established, and Estonia was folded into the institutional structure of medieval Christendom. On paper, Christianization had worked, so to speak. And by the 1700s, Estonia was unquestionably Christian in an official sense. By this time, following the Great Northern War, it was politically Lutheran and firmly part of the European Christian world, a Lutheran territory within the Russian Empire. And yet, Christianity apparently had still not become deeply integrated among the Estonians. Now, before we talk about what survived into the modern period, we need to be clear about something up front. We actually know very little about pre-Christian Estonian religion. There is no equivalent here to Norse or Greek mythology or the vast amount of archaeological evidence we have for Greco-Roman paganism. What we have instead is a patchwork of archaeology, later folklore, and medieval and early modern ethnography, like Hupel, who I quoted earlier. What the evidence does suggest is that there was a strong focus on sacred natural places, groves, stones, springs, and the ongoing relationships with non-human beings understood to inhabit or personify those places. Now, as I mentioned, this is often described as a form of animism, in the sense that agency and personhood were attributed to elements of the natural world. Our sources also preserve the names of multiple gods, linked with fertility, weather, households, and the agricultural cycle, though we lack any sort of clear idea of how these beings related to each other in a structured pantheon, or how they were worshipped before Christian contact. No priestly manuals, again, no mythological epics written down before conversion, no internal theological explanations. So in other words, we can speak with some level of confidence about practices in sacred places, and with much less confidence about theology or myth. Complicating matters even further is the heavy influence of 19th century Romantic nationalism. As Estonian intellectuals in the modern period tried to recover a pre-Christian past, they often heavily relied on folklore for their reconstructions. Folklore which was recorded very late in history and frequently through the lens of nationalist revival. For that reason, Estonian scholars such as Tõnu Junuks, who is an expert on Estonian religion, is deeply skeptical of approaches that simply take 19th or 20th century descriptions of sacred grove practices and project them straight back into pre-Christian history. As Dr. Junuks puts it, a vision of Estonian pagan religion was formed in the 19th century as the cult of nature gods based on a polytheistic pantheon, where rituals took place in holy oak groves, sacrifices were brought to gods, and dead people were burned on pyres. But this vision rests on very thin evidence. In some cases, entire reconstructions were built on almost nothing. For example, the modern revival of the Estonian thunder god Tara ultimately rests on a single word in the Chronicle of Henry of Livonia, where he mentions Tara in passing. Now, that doesn't mean that pre-Christian Estonians didn't worship a god named Tara, but it does mean we should not overstate what we know about pre-Christian Estonian belief. We know so little because there's so little data. Aside from scattered archaeological evidence, most of what we're seeing comes to us indirectly, filtered through later Christian sources that were not trying to accurately preserve pagan traditions so much as to try to condemn them. Remember, as Dr. Young argues elsewhere, what we're likely dealing with by the time these sources appear is not a pristine pre-Christian religion at all, but a creolized Estonian religion shaped by Christian contact. Now, the firmest evidence we have for pre-Christian Estonian religion involves sacred groves called his. Some of these sites appear to be very old, probably dating as far back as the late Bronze Age or pre-Roman Iron Age. These early groves tend to sit on visually striking natural features: hills, ridges, cliff edges, places that stand out dramatically from the surrounding landscape and would be impossible to ignore in everyday life. Across Finland, Estonia, and Latvia, stones with cut marks, usually for ritual offerings, are known to have been used from the Bronze Age all the way up to the 20th century, which, according to Dr. Young, may make them some of the longest continuously functioning ritual sites in Europe, even as their meaning and significance changed over time. These groves are also often found near ancient stone graves. Dr. Young suggests that in this early phase, groves likely functioned as communal ritual centers connected to ancestors, places where communities reinforce their lineage and their tie to the land. Starting around the 5th century CE, things began to shift in ancient Estonia. New stone graves stopped being built, and religious life becomes more closely tied to permanent villages rather than to ancestral burial sites. Many of the sacred groves known from later folklore reflect this era of history. In this phase of ancient Estonian religion, groves now seem to function more as village-based sacred places. Places tied to the cycle of the seasons, village prosperity, and rituals for local gods, which happen to be the sort of practices mentioned by medieval writers like Henry of Livonia and early modern writers like Hupel. Dr. Young argues that Christianization here in Estonia amounted to failed integration. Christianity arrived through conquest, but it didn't fully reorganize everyday religious life for centuries. Sacred places continued to matter well into the modern period. An early account comes from the aforementioned Henry of Livonia. Composed in the early 13th century, Henry describes Christian priests entering a region in northeastern Estonia and baptizing villages there, where there was a hill and a pretty forest where the local people said that the big god of the Osilians was born, who was called Tara, and the other priest went breaking the figures and faces of their gods. If we take Henry even roughly at his word, this episode suggests that sacred hills, forested sites, and the worship of a polytheistic pantheon were still active parts of the local religious landscape in the early 1200s. And when Henry references Tara as the god of the Osilians, he's referring to the people of Saaremaa, the large island off Estonia's western coast, which Dr. Young describes as one of the most resilient holdouts of pre-Christian Estonian religion. As we move into the 18th century, the aforementioned German pastor August Wilhelm Hupel describes religious practices still taking place at sacred natural sites. In central Estonia, he describes an altar where even now offerings could be found under the sacred tree. There is a big granite altar. It is 2 feet high, of the same length, flat on top, oval-shaped. It is generally known that the altar comes from heathen times. About 25 years later, an Estonian pastor even drew the same place, a presumably pre-Christian altar that people continued to recognize and visit in the early 1800s. Hupel also describes sacred groves scattered across the countryside. In some places there is one, in some there are many trees. Mostly spruces, these are on hills, fields, by the springs, and other places. Peasants who are not afraid of punishment bury their dead people in these places. He goes on to describe that people brought offerings to these groves, which were left at stones or placed into tree hollows. What's especially striking is how resistant these sites were to suppression. Landlords apparently tried ordering villagers to cut down these trees, but repeatedly failed because locals refused to do it. Hupel describes one case in which a man who cut down part of an ancient forest became convinced that the forest's protective spirits were now haunting his dreams. These beings were known as Ma Elucid, those who live beneath the earth. And in another case, the landlord had to cut down the grove himself because no one else would touch it. At the same time, Hupel's accounts show how deeply Christian elements had already become woven into this religious world. Estonians observed Christian saints' days, but often in ways that made sense within older frameworks. In Western Estonia, a figure associated with Saint Anthony known as Tun became linked to household prosperity and livestock, especially with pigs. On Tun's feast day, people cooked a pig's head and brought offerings to sacred groves and stones. Again, this looks a lot like the syncretism or creolization we see in traditions like Haitian Vodou, where a Christian saint and a West African deity could be identified with the same spirit. In this case, a non-Christian spirit is linked with Saint Anthony. Hupel was also struck by how deeply Estonian everyday life diverged from what he understood as Christian European norms, especially when it came to sex. According to Hupel, the Estonians did not have a concept of virginity that dominated much of Christian sexual ethics. Premarital sex apparently was not treated as a moral failure or a source of shame. Some scholars theorize that this might indicate that Estonian sexual culture remained largely disconnected from the moral framework promoted by Lutheran Christianity, and might even reflect pre-Christian social structures. And even as we go into the 1800s, sources mention fishermen on the island of Saaremaa still thanking a sea mother goddess for a good catch. In southern Estonia, offerings continued to be made to gods connected with livestock. And in the region of Mulgimaa in southern Estonia, people continue to worship a grain spirit called Pel. In fact, in a 1958 interview, an 83-year-old woman remembers a Christian priest attempting to exorcise Pel from a granary when she was a kid, probably sometime in the 1880s. One of the most striking cases is the worship of a grain and fertility figure named Pekko, venerated among the Seto people. The Setos are a small Finno-Ugric ethnic group living in a region called Setomaa, right along the modern border between Estonia and Russia. For centuries, this region sat at a cultural crossroads. While most Estonians became at least nominally Lutheran, the Setos followed Eastern Orthodoxy, which tied them historically to the Russian religious world. Though, as with other parts of Estonia, Christianization did not erase older traditions. Veneration of Pekko among the Setos survived longer than most other non-Christian practices. Into the early 20th century, small rural fraternities maintained secret ritual traditions centered on this figure. Members would conceal a carved image of Pekko in a grain bin throughout the winter. Then, toward the end of the agricultural cycle in late summer, they would hold ritual gatherings that included contests and games to select a new ritual leader. Today, Pekko has taken on a new life in Seto cultural identity. Every year, the Seto people hold an event called Seto Kingdom Day. According to tradition, the kingdom's true ruler is Pekko himself, now imagined not just as a fertility god, but as a legendary ancestral king who sleeps in a cave and will one day awaken to defend his people. Because Pekko is absent, the community elects a representative who speaks for the Seto people during the coming year. So why the slow Christianization in Estonia? Now, as with any cultural process like Christianization, there's no single reason. The historian Sylvan Guggenheim has identified 4 major reasons why Christianization stalled in the Baltics. First, negligent missionaries, often poorly trained or uninterested in deeper cultural engagement. Number 2, weak church infrastructure with no consistent pastoral presence. Number 3, sheer geographic remoteness, which made sustained Christian presence difficult. And number 4, language barriers, which hindered understanding and instruction. In much of Western and Southern Europe, Christianity spread among peoples whose languages were closely related to those of Christian elites, like how local Romance languages like Spanish and French shared deep roots with Latin. In places like Estonia, Latvia, Finland, and the Sámi territories, missionaries were working with entirely different language families, making it more difficult to translate ideas like the Trinity or salvation. And Dr. Young adds a crucial factor: active resistance. Many communities in these regions actively resisted Christianization. But Estonia had a set of local conditions that made this resistance especially durable. First, Christianity in Estonia was overwhelmingly mediated by Baltic Germans. From the Middle Ages onward, religious authority, land ownership, and political power were concentrated in the hands of a German-speaking ruling class. The church was not perceived as Estonian, it was perceived as part of the same elite structure that controlled land, labor, and enforced serfdom. Related to this, Lutheranism was closely linked with landlords, while Orthodoxy was linked with a distant and foreign state, the Russian Empire. So for ordinary Estonians, Christianity did not present itself as a compelling alternative religion. It was either the religion of your landlord or the religion of a Russian czar hundreds of miles away. Third, conversion offered no meaningful social mobility. In a lot of colonial or frontier contexts, adopting the dominant religion could bring tangible benefits, new legal status, economic opportunities, access to education. But in Estonia, no matter how sincerely an Estonian peasant embraced Christianity, they could never become a German. The historian Heikki Valk has argued that this system of ethno-social segregation effectively prolonged medieval conditions in Estonia far longer than elsewhere in Europe. Estonians remained under foreign religious instruction for centuries, with little incentive to culturally Christianize. The result was essentially, as Dr. Young puts it, failed integration, where Christianity never fully displaced earlier religious habits. So let's return to where we began. It's 1789. Revolutions are remaking the Atlantic world. And in rural Estonia, villagers are still engaging with pre-Christian spirits and gods, leaving offerings at sacred trees, stones, and springs. It's one of several examples challenging the idea that Europe simply crossed a line from pagan to Christian sometime in the Middle Ages. Religious change is a slow and uneven process, and shaped just as much by power as it is by religious habits deeply ingrained in a culture. Today, a lot of people are reviving pre-Christian religions themselves. In fact, forms of contemporary paganism like modern Druidry and Wicca are among the fastest growing religions in the US and Europe. If this topic fascinates you, then you should really join our upcoming seminar, Intro to Contemporary Paganism. This is an 8-week online course taught by Thorn Mooney. She's an amazing scholar of religion and the author of the book Witches Among Us. In this class, Thorn will help you make sense of the surprisingly wide range of modern pagan traditions, and how they relate to things like witchcraft, magic, and environmental spirituality. She's also an incredible teacher, and you know what? I'll just let her tell you herself. So Thorn, why should anyone take your class?
Because There's a lot of overlap between what's going on amongst the people who call themselves pagans and a lot of other traditions you've probably heard of, as well as some of the popular movements that we see just in our day to day. Things like manifestation and the law of attraction, things like alternative healing, the contemporary witchcraft movement, people who are interested in magic, environmentalism and nature, all of these things that we find in other parts of our lives convene in this large movement. So it's great to know something about it.
So Intro to Contemporary Paganism will run for 8 weeks every Wednesday starting on March 25th. And the best way to join is through our membership bundle. The early bird pricing is $199. That gets you the full seminar plus a year-long membership to the religion department. The religion department is a place for people who love learning about religion and want to engage seriously with religion as an academic subject. We bring together scholars and curious learners like yourself for seminars, guest lectures, and ongoing reading groups. So if you want to sign up, head on over to religiondepartment.com/contemporary paganism, and I hope to see you there.